All right, well, let's go ahead and get started then. Hi, I'm Evelyn Hartman, the Education and Impact Associate with Future Generations University, and welcome to Out of the Woods, Enriching Your Maple Business. This is a free monthly webinar series put on by Future Generations University that covers a wide range of topics related to tree syrup production, marketing, and enterprise management. During tonight's webinar, we'll be learning about the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, and several of their forestry and wildlife conservation planning programs and what it's like to work with NRCS as a landowner. After these presentations, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So go ahead and submit your questions throughout the presentation if you like as they come up, or wait until that Q&A session, up to you. We do ask that you submit those questions through that Q&A box that we were just using. And then if you want to say hi, say where you're from, general comments throughout, use the chat box for that, and that's awesome. All right, so with us tonight, we have Jane Capizzelli, the Partner Avian Biologist with the USDA-NRCS and the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources, followed by Kevin Gregory, a landowner from Ireland, West Virginia, and owner of Eagle Land Transformations. So I first met Jane at a Forest Stewards Guild workshop last year and have been really fortunate to work with Jane ever since through a project that I work on called Reading the Woods. And through Reading the Woods, I get to work with all sorts of service providers from across the state and the woodland stewards that they work with. We assess forests and get to know the woodland stewards to best guide them in identifying nature-based enterprises, or what we refer to as timber and non-timber forest products and services, or NTFPs. So if that's something you, as either a service provider or a landowner listening, would be interested in learning more about, feel free to email us at forest@future.edu. It's a little shameless plug for our program there. But back to NRCS and Jane, what I found is that NRCS conservation practices really complement a lot of the forest management practices that produce these timber and non-timber forest products, including sugar bush management for maple syrup, which we'll hear more about this evening. Jane has been in her position with NRCS and the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources since February 2021. Prior to this position, Jane was staff researcher for Wild Animal Initiative. She holds a Master of Science in Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her master's research focused on songbird ecology and landscape restoration. I did do a little background research on you and discovered that your dream is to one day start a seagull sanctuary. So there you have some fun fact about Jane. And then our second presenter this evening is Kevin Gregory. Kevin returned to West Virginia near his hometown of Ireland in 2017 after retiring from the U.S. Army, serving as second lieutenant since 1988. Gregory holds both an AS and BS in criminal justice and an executive master's degree in business administration and a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. Kevin operates Eagle Land Transformations that specializes in wildlife habitat management, consulting and services, and excavation services. Although they provide a wide variety of excavation services, their passion is wildlife habitat management. So hopefully we have some bird lovers and wildlife lovers out there in the audience today. But yeah, Jane, if you want to go ahead and take it away for us.
Great, thank you, Evelyn. And it's really great to be here with everybody.
Thank you for being here.
So I think we're good to go on seeing my presentation.
Looks great.
Fabulous. So today the topic will be talking about whole forest conservation planning and using the NRCS assistance to do so. And that'll focus on technical assistance, going through the process of identifying objectives and management practices and goals, and then talk a bit about the financial assistance aspects too. As we were saying, I'm the partner biologist at NRCS and DNR. I'm based out of Fairmont, and I cover landowners in West Virginia, all over the north area, anything north of Lewis County. And there's also some counterparts, my coworkers for Southern West Virginia. So any private landowner or forest operator that lives in West Virginia, definitely welcome to participate with me or with NRCS in general. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service is part of the USDA. Its mission is to help people help the land. That's the mission statement. And the main way of doing that is to provide owners and operators with technical and financial assistance. Technical assistance is going to range from advice to full forest program or forest planning or farm planning, a wide range of agricultural needs. And then financial assistance is there's several programs that are based on cost share assistance for falling out on your farm or forest management plan. Specifically, the program I work most in is EQIP, and EQIP focuses a lot on your Appalachian forest priorities, specifically forest health and wildlife habitat. More than 3 forest management programs at NRCS support the whole forest conservation plan. 3 I'm most familiar with is your general forestry program, and then 2 sub-programs or projects, your cerulean warbler forest land enhancement project and your working lands for wildlife golden wing warbler project. The 2 sub-programs are focused on these bird species just because wildlife conservation is such a big goal for NRCS. At least 10% of all your financial assistance funding is dedicated to wildlife conservation. So quite a significant amount. And also that's driven by landowner objectives. It's an extremely important goal to conserve wildlife among private landowners in West Virginia. So that's how we get to the sub-programs on cerulean golden wing warblers. So to think about what the typical objectives of West Virginia forest owners are, when I meet people in the woods or on their property, I was thinking, what are the top objectives I usually hear? Honestly, the top I hear is benefiting wildlife, enjoying the land, increasing production of forest products, which could be timber or non-timber or recreation, and then general stewardship, passing on the property in better shape than it was before. Just some context on West Virginia forests, 85% of all of the forest land in West Virginia is privately owned. In terms of family ownerships, it comes out to 6.5 million acres of forest land, a huge proportion in the context of West Virginia and North America forest lands. 25% of owners feel that timber production is important, which leaves your other 75% of folks who aren't interested in that as a goal, which I think is interesting. Also, only 10% of owners earn annual income from their forest. So that makes the audience here on sugar production pretty unusual that you have an annual enterprise, and definitely was making me really excited to participate with Future Generations University because it's such a interesting area where landowners might want to expand if only 90 or if only 10% of people participate in annual income from the forest lands. But lastly, 40% of owners want to improve wildlife habitat in the next 5 years. So in general, wildlife habitat is a very common objective. Hence, it's a big focus on the whole farm conservation planning at NRCS. And that brings us to our focal species, one of which is cerulean warbler. And so this first video is of the female cerulean warbler building her nest. And Cerulean warblers are small songbirds. They migrate, their breeding range is Appalachia, and then their wintering range is Peru, Venezuela. So they make the 8,000-mile round journey every year. And just to give you an idea of the size, it's a 9-gram bird. So it weighs as much as 1 nickel and 1 dime if you're holding that in your hand. So it's a really, really small but mighty animal. And now, as the female is making her nest in the breeding range, the male has chosen the territory. They'll choose a fairly successional forest, very mature trees, oak hickory forest, and they'll hold a territory that's suitable, while the female will choose a specific nest site to build the nest. The fledglings will spend about 2 weeks in the nest itself before they jump to the ground, and then they spend about a week or 2 on the forest floor, which is where the understory quality comes in really important, because without your understory, you won't have any surviving juveniles from the nest. Right, so just to go back to the types of forests the cerulean warbler is looking for, it's going to be a really broad range of forest types that have these canopy gaps in common. So you could have anything from a 100-foot gap in the woods here to a 40-foot gap in the woods. This probably is going to look familiar to people with a sugar bush stand, or maybe people who are trying to create one, which we'll get into sort of at the end of the talk there. The second focal species will be the golden wing warbler. This is a young forest and shrubland bird. It has a really buzzy call. So their primary habitat would be shrublands and young forests, one of the rarest habitat types in West Virginia. And that's something that the 2 focal species share in common, and why they're flagship species is that these early successional young forest habitats are rare in the context of the landscape. Now, going back to our ideal outcome of the programs is that we could make a whole forest conservation plan, no matter what plan you're working, or excuse me, no matter what program you're working with on NRCS. An ideal outcome is going to be a whole forest conservation plan that can incorporate all of your stands on the property and give you a management timeline 5 to 10 years into the future. And the first way we get to that type of planning is we look at objectives. Each landowner is going to have unique objectives tailored completely to their stand and their needs. I tried to think what would be typical maybe of this audience of a sugar bush farmer. So maybe your first idea, your first objective is to maintain resiliency in your sugar bush. Secondly, you might be interested in increasing syrup production. You might be interested in expanding to new non-timber forest products, and you definitely want to benefit wildlife on the farm. So just start with objective 1. What's a problem? Why isn't the sugar bush resilient? You, as a landowner, might have identified pests as a problem. I know that sugar maples are susceptible to pests and diseases, and I'm worried my stand is vulnerable to decline. I've definitely heard that working with landowners for sure. Decline is a tree disease. Decline is when the tree growth is slower, and in sugar maples, as a tree grows, it'll start self-thinning its branches, self-pruning. So decline is the overarching problem with when the tree becomes vulnerable to disease and pests. Because sugar maples are slow growing and shade tolerant, any trees losing out competitively begin declining. They won't die outright because they're shade tolerant, but eventually other stressors will kill any trees that are in decline. So just to analyze a little bit more, you have a tree in decline. It's not competitively dominant. It's overtopped. It's shaded out. So what eventually kills this stressed tree might be a climate change stressor. So you might be seeing on your site poor soil drainage. The ground's really wet. It's been raining a ton this year, and that's where your die-off comes out. Or it's been very, very dry this year. You have drought that is atypical. Another stressor really common is these fungal diseases, root rots, at least two different types of root rots. They're not invasive pathogens, they're normal native pathogens, but it's when the tree's in decline that they become vulnerable. And then lastly, stressors from caterpillars and other bugs, insect herbivores, leaf eaters. We're going to hold on to caterpillars because that definitely relates back to the warbler management. But these three stressors are your big killers of stressed out sugar maple trees, and that's what degrades your resiliency in the stand. So the prescription that we would come up with as we discuss all the concerns with disease and stress and resiliency is thinning. Thinning keeps the trees healthy. We've made these large canopy gaps. Your best producing sugar maples have as much resources as they need. That decline is no longer an issue for them. So that's our management prescription. Now, maybe another problem to your resiliency is understory regeneration. You noticed all of my maples are the same age. If there is a die-off, I have no young maples to replace them. It'd be decades before the stand can produce again, which this is a great example, this picture. You can see that all these trees are the same age. They're about the same diameter, and there isn't any young trees in the mix there. So that's really the sign of when your understory regeneration may not be as good as it could be. It depends on objective, but we'll go through the example. Two huge barriers to understory regeneration. First is the light competition. So that's the thinning is your first step, but still you have issues with especially brush management. You could have non-native invasive plants, autumn olive, multiflora rose, or you can have native competitors. So we have ferns, we have striped maple, beech, brush, red maple. If you're regenerating a specific crop in the forest, then your understory management is going to be very specifically targeted to your desirable tree species. So in this case, you've done a thinning, but you're not getting, and you're targeting a sugar maple regeneration. Competition control through brush management with natives or non-natives is probably going to be a supporting practice we would put in your whole forest plan.
One of the most significant issues facing Appalachian forests today is invasive species vegetation. In the area on the left, an herbicide application targeting ferns was applied last growing season. The herbicide has acted like weeding a garden, creating better growing conditions for desirable plants and trees by offering more space and light in the understory. Over time, desirable tree seedlings like oaks and hickories will begin to grow here, but additional spot treatments of herbicide might be needed to keep the ferns from reestablishing. Compare this treated area to the adjacent untreated area. Here, ferns still dominate the understory and are outcompeting desirable plants and trees. Competing vegetation can also be a problem in the forest midstory. Look up to see how striped maple saplings in this stand are blocking the sunlight and casting shade on the forest floor. This makes the conditions poor for establishing oak seedlings, which require more sunlight to grow. Look down at the ground and you'll see only striped maple seedlings are growing here. In this adjacent stand, herbicide was applied last growing season to control the striped maple. Look up to see sunlight coming through the canopy trees. More sunlight is now able to reach the forest floor, offering better conditions for the growth of oak seedlings and other desirable plants.
Great. So to me, the big benefit of this video is the striped maple section. I think that those little mid-story beach brush, striped maple, red maple are overlooked often in your understory management. They're native plants, but they dominate your understory once there's a release. Also, they are in the same size class as a sapling sugar maple, which means that even if you have a great sugar maple regeneration year, you'll have competitors of the same size, your beech and your striped maple. So even your young sugar maples that have sprouted won't make it up through to become mature trees. So you can't regenerate a stand without competition control in this case. So definitely a practice to keep in mind when you're trying to advance different mixed age groups in your forest stand to increase your resiliency. If you're able to establish younger sugar maples under your mature trees, then you've added like 20, 30, 40 years of time that protects you, because you have 40-year-old young trees that are ready to take the place of if there's a catastrophe in your main stand, essentially. One thing that is not in this video is a discussion about deer, which is great that Kevin is here because he's an expert on deer management. Everybody has deer, but you may or may not have a deer problem. Whether you have too many deer really depends on the objective you have in your management. So if your objective is sugar maple regeneration, yes, you probably have a deer problem just because deer so favor browsing of sugar maples. You might, in this case, want to use exclusion fencing either around the whole stand or in spots that would protect your young trees from deer browse. Alternatively, you might have deer but not a deer problem if, say, you want to do a thinning but you don't want a huge influx of understory brush. Maybe you want to do the thinning, but if you have too much understory, your sap collection and your tubing issues would be really complicated by the brush regeneration. So in this case, deer would help you with your objective because low to medium browsing would keep that understory in check. So you kind of think about deer adaptively, something you want to monitor, how the browse effects are impacting the objectives you have, and if you need to adjust, maybe with deer exclusion or other tactics. So definitely recommend monitoring for deer browse. And I wonder if this would be a good Q&A discussion since it's so variable on different sites. All right, so objective 2, you want to increase your syrup production. I think that it's going to be pretty common knowledge that larger trees produce more sap, and that has to do with thinning, because if you thin, you get a big explosion in tree size. So your growth before thinning, the top picture is about a 50-year-old tree, and then after thinning, the tree was released, and your diameter growth that you can see after your 50 years is, if you have a 10-inch diameter tree, you add 4 inches every 10 years. You have an 18-inch tree, you'd add 2 inches every 10 years. And you can expect that increased rate for 20 to 30 years after your thinning prescription, depending on your growing conditions on site. I think that this would be another discussion topic because thinning, everyone's going to see different impacts, different results, how the thinning impacted their stand, and also then how that thinning increases your production of syrup, or maybe not. If that's even an option, if you're interested in doing that, if it's a main objective motivating you for thinning, and what are the implications if your sap production increased? Would that help your farm, benefit what you want to do? Or maybe you're kind of at a threshold where your equipment and such wouldn't allow for that. So at any rate, it's I think like a one-on-one case-by-case decision how to plan your thinning to improve your farm. And definitely part of the NRCS process would be discussing that and how it would impact your farm over the next 10 years, for example. All right, your third objective, definitely something you want to explore, is expanding to new non-timber forest products. The best advice for this is to consult a forester with experience in non-timber product production. Always, no matter what your goal, consulting the right forester puts you in a position to accomplish your objectives. Forester is an investment in the woods. And in West Virginia, there's a couple ways to hire a forester. The West Virginia Division of Forestry has in each county your county service foresters. Those should be free, available to the public, and you want to contact your Division of Forestry office to get in touch with them. Another option is there are technical service providers, NRCS TSPs, and they're certified with NRCS to do forest management plans that follow NRCS guidelines. This can help you. This will help you in the future because the TSPs will write you a plan that's going to be geared toward the practices at NRCS. They speak the practices language and they're familiar with that application process. So that can be a benefit to working with NRCS technical service providers. On the other hand, a benefit to working with the state is that a state forest management plan can give you property tax benefits depending on what county you live in West Virginia, and that's on a county by county basis. The point being, exploring your options between the two is going to help you decide what's the best way to go about it. And then your third option still is hiring a private consulting foresters. There's dozens, possibly a few hundred private consulting foresters listed on the West Virginia database. And these just mean they're certified with the state of West Virginia and they're just private, work for themselves or work for forestry companies. So definitely a lot of options, and it's critically important to talk to many different foresters to figure out who's going to be the best fit, who knows, who's speaking your language, especially if you want to expand to this kind of new area, non-timber forest products, because whoever you work with, this is your investment. They'll write you a plan for the next 10 years, and that's quite a bit of time. And then lastly, our last objective would be benefiting wildlife. But the problem is that we need to also benefit the whole farm enterprise when we're doing our management. So I hear all the time talking to landowners, I definitely want to manage for wildlife, definitely no question there, but the management needs to be done in a certain way so I can meet my farming goals as well. And it would be even more important for someone earning annual income from their farm to thread the needle on wildlife management and whole farm enterprise planning, just because it's important to meet multiple objectives at the same time. So when I'm in this dilemma, always just go back to your whole forest plan. You have your stand map, you have ideas on different prescriptions you might do, and you look for opportunities where you'll meet multiple objectives. So to me, this plan is standing out, this map stands out for a couple opportunities where we could meet our first three objectives plus benefit wildlife. So the first, I should explain the map a bit. So we'll start with the yellow, the clear cuts. Clear cut is you just have a mature forest, you're adding little 5 acre clear cuts. We're expecting young forest to regenerate. It has variety. It creates young forest, which is your rare habitat type. That's a wildlife benefit right there, just by having habitat variety on the landscape. So you cut every tree within that 5 acre square or circle, and ideally you let the trees degrade on their own, just regenerates the soil. You might also build brush piles. You might use the clear cut trunks for firewood or other non-timber products. But I usually start with recommending leaving the slash there just to degrade it on its own. And then over time, you manage the shrubland young forest regeneration with periodic disturbance. So in about 10 to 15 years after your clear cut, your shrubland should develop like this in an ideal scenario. So year 1, clear cut, year 10, shrubland. This is what the outcomes we'd like to see. And what's the other use of your clear cut? On a landowner I have, this is a real live example, is that they did the clear cutting to enhance ecotourism on their farm. If you're a sugar producer, you might have your blue stand where the sugar bush is, and you might have it set up so people can visit the farm and walk through. A client I had has a distillery, so that's why he has his distillery here at the beginning. Unfortunately, his area was a degraded stand. It wasn't something that had a lot of wildlife reviewing value. So we set up clear cuts specifically to attract early successional birds. And he's going to see great results because it's such a productive habitat type. And you get rare birds in your young forest, grouse. Everybody knows grouse, but some other really important birds, yellow-breasted chat, yellow-billed cuckoo, chestnut-sided warbler, and about a dozen others. These 3 are really flashy, quite attractive, easy to see because they're kind of at eye level. So I don't know if you want to have these people, these birdwatcher people on your property, but I will tell you that this was me. This is how I became a bird biologist, is I went on an ecotourism adventure walk and I got hooked on birding, and it's changed my life. So I didn't wear this outfit, but I could now. So I really actually think that this works, or can work if you're interested in it. I've heard of it working and I've had that experience. So I'd be very interested in this type of planning procedure. Totally another topic, possibly another use of your shrubland young forest. If you have a large area like this gray here, this is a shrubland, it's pre-existing, it's already established. You might be able to use prescribed grazing. You can definitely use prescribed grazing to maintain golden-winged warbler habitat long-term, so you know you can satisfy your wildlife objectives. Possibly grazing can be an alternative forest enterprise, thinking silvopasture. But this is very experimental and very difficult to silvopasture. First of all, we're not putting silvopasture in your new clear cuts. This is more of a shrubland. It was an old field. Now it's just an invaded old field. It's not a freshly cut forest. So that's one of the big differences of this. Then there's a long list of things that you should have to have a successful silvopasture or wildlife grazing area. It must be cattle, and it must be low stocking rate. So an AMU, that's an Angus bull or a cow-calf pair. So it's 1 cow per 3 acres. So approximating this gray area as 20 acres, it's 6 cows. That's it. It's a very low stocking rate because you think about half this area is shrub. It's not grass forage. 1 animal units per 3 acres, only 6 cows. Then you rotate the grazing and you adapt your stocking and rotation each year, depending on the forage base available. You cannot overgraze or overstock your shrubland areas if you're doing silvopasture, because it's very difficult to restore an area that's been overgrazed. You cannot, it must be native cool season, warm season forage grass. That has to do again with the overgrazing issue. If you have native grass, shrub regeneration is much easier to control. So it's much more productive. So you're less likely to overgraze. So that's where what type of forage grass is growing is really important. Again, monitoring, you have to be in there every year to decide, or every month really, to decide when you rotate the cows out and what you're going to do next year. And this is a little bit of a joke, but if it's not working on your site, you have to take a step back and say, maybe cattle in this area isn't going to work. It can work, can be a way to maintain disturbance, or in some sites, it's just not suitable. Absolutely what will not work if you're trying to graze your shrubland is no goats, no sheep, no horses, llamas, pigs, cryptids, mothmen, flatwoods goats. That has to do with that all these other types of livestock browse, so they degrade your silvopasture area. You can't use concentrated area use, no hay feeders, no salt licks, maybe water troughs, because you can't concentrate the cows at the same place because they turn it into a mud pit. You have to have a fence, no access to woods, no access to streams. Again, the forage base, no fescue, no brome, no non-native upland forage grasses. It's really difficult to regenerate once it's overgrazed. No invasive shrubs, and don't do it yourself. Follow a prescribed grazing plan, which is available at NRCS. We're happy to work with you on this type of grazing plan. Monitoring comes into effect. Grade planning is what you need to really give it a start. Most people do not use prescribed grazing to maintain their golden winged warbler habitat. They'll use mowing, brush hogging. So it's still rotational mowing and brush hogging. You get great results. A lot of people enjoy brush hogging, but there's options. So it's always site specific what people want to do on their farm. Back to our sugar bush area, so our mature woods. What type of thinning are we going to use? Heavy thinning, which would be the impacts here, would regenerate the undestroyed. This is the prescription I would prescribe if we want to regenerate young sugar maples, add a mixed age stand, and it creates ideal cerulean warbler habitat. The cerulean warbler loves large gaps like this and large trees. It's a little hard to tell, but these trees are all about 18 inches diameter or larger, which is zoomed out really far in this photo. So I would prescribe a heavy thinning if you wanted to make ideal habitat for cerulean and have a mixed age stand to regenerate here. Also, you can use this prescription if you want to add more acreage to your sugar bush. You could picture everything we thinned out might have been red maple or hickory or black gum. Now it's going to be dominated by sugar maple. So this heavy thinning can be a good way to shift the composition of the woods and add more sugar bush. So that's two thoughts there. Maybe you want to do a light thinning in different areas. This is still suitable cerulean warbler habitat, really excellent. They will nest definitely on the gaps here. And this is going to be better for adding diameter growth, like a modest amount of diameter growth to a pre-existing stand to get those increases in steer production. This is the prescription that would mimic what we saw in the growth rings on the couple slides before. You don't want to thin more than 1/4 to 1/3 in an existing sugar bush stand every 10 years. So this is about what a stand would look like if you thinned 1/4 to 1/3 of it out. So the caterpillars, if you remember our stress and decline, light thinning, and if you remember that your insect herbivores is ultimately what kills your sugar trees once they're in decline. It's just the stress of them losing the leaves is what ultimately does them in. Your light thinning would protect against caterpillar stress. So you have your resiliency goal met because the thinning creates cerulean warbler habitat. And this is because cerulean warblers are the ultimate caterpillar eaters. Two really terrible pests in sugar maples are your fall webworm and fall cankerworm. What's important to know about these types of insects is they are green inchworms. This is the main food base of cerulean warbler. They're specialist caterpillar eaters. This is the male cerulean warbler, and that's the call. So even as he's calling, he's looking around and he's foraging. And we'll see, that's the head tilt, is he's actually checking the leaves. So it's called being a foliage gleaner. And so now he has an inchworm caterpillar. And so they manipulate the insect and they hit it on the trunk of the branch there to stun it. And then they just spaghetti it up there. So here he has another webworm. And he stuns it, and then it's gone. So they can eat hundreds of webworms a day. It's their specialty. This footage is very interesting. It's a young, immature cerulean warbler male. And this is the illustration of a bird that is not specialized in eating caterpillars. It's going, because it really shows a difference, like why the cerulean warbler is the warbler for this task. So this bird's not experienced, so it's chosen a caterpillar that's too big. So this is analogous to a generic common bird foraging in the overstory, but it cannot efficiently eat caterpillars. So this bird, just through the time of day, it will only eat dozens of webworms and cankerworms. It takes this bird minutes to eat this caterpillar. When it's more experienced, conspecific, they're ate in about 5 seconds. So that gets to the ecology of foraging and why the cerulean warbler specifically helps you with sugar maple resiliency. It's really the caterpillar eating. They're the specialists in worm eating. And then thinking about our other caterpillar pests. Even more important pest species, gypsy moth, your fall webworm, as it's a mature caterpillar, it gets fuzzy. Tent caterpillars will erupt. So you might get hundreds of thousands of tent caterpillars in some years. In some years, it's a devastating tent caterpillar outbreak. In other years, you don't see them. Gypsy moth is an invasive moth. It's there all year. So definitely a huge issue for North American hardwood trees. All these caterpillars are spiny or fuzzy. The only bird that really is specialist on a fuzzy caterpillar is the cuckoos. There's yellow-billed cuckoo, which is in this video, and also black-billed cuckoo. So you see how this bird is actually shaving the caterpillar. It has a pretty long beak. This is a big bird. It's like the size of a blue jay. So it has a large hooked beak, so it's shaving the caterpillar back and forth, getting rid of some of the spines. The spines are not digestible. Secondly, what will happen is this cuckoo will eat thousands of caterpillars a day. And then eventually it has so many spines in its gut that it sheds the lining of its gut, throws up a huge bolus of spines, and then continues on its day and can eat another 1,000. A bird that doesn't have this adaptation to vomit could actually die from eating fuzzy caterpillars because it causes a crop obstruction, or it's like when your Labrador eats a sock. That's kind of the same thing when a non-cuckoo eats too many fuzzy caterpillars. So it's really a specific adaptation in the yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoo family to eat these fuzzy caterpillars like this. It does eventually eat it. I watched it for accuracy. I think ending on the cuckoo is a great note to talk about how whole forest planning is whole forest ecosystem health. Your cuckoo uses your clear cut areas, will use the edge, mature forest and clear cuts. And then if you have your heavy thinning here in the pink, your light thinning where you have your sugar maple stand, you have your young forest you're maintaining over time with types of disturbance, you have a whole food web here in place, and it's a resilient ecosystem. And this is the ideal outcome of the whole forest planning at NRCS, especially if you work with wildlife experts, is your whole farm plan taking in as many objectives and as many angles as it can. So that's, I think, the overview of how to do a whole forest plan. It's always with objectives, identify problems, think of management prescriptions. And so I want to introduce Kevin. He's at Eagle Land Transformations. He's a forestry contractor and a private landowner, so we appreciate his insights.
Hey, well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for the great introduction, Jane. I didn't know you were going to show so many violent videos, but being a military man, I appreciate that. I just have a few questions here that Evelyn had passed on to me to answer. So let me see if I can pull those up real quick. Jane, can you stop sharing your screen real fast, and I'll pull those up. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that, and I'll kick that into presentation mode. So just real quick, kind of who I am. Evelyn introduced me a while ago, but basically I did about 29 years in the military, but I'm a native West Virginian, born and bred here in Braxton County, center part of the state, kind of on the edge of golden winged warbler and cerulean warbler habitat. So that was kind of my background. Throughout my time in the military, I've always been a hunter, of course, and loved white-tailed deer, rough grouse, and bear. So I've spent my entire time in the military basically doing my own personal study and on white-tailed deer, their habitat. And then if you heard earlier, none of my degrees are in biology or any of those areas, but my passion is. So when I retired, I started a business that basically does whitetail management or wildlife habitat consulting. So why the NRCS? And I'll walk through just a few of these questions briefly, then we can open it up to questions if anybody has any of me. But I really found out about NRCS through an article that one of my good friends had posted in a local newspaper after I'd retired in 2017. And I had property. I'd already done basically a whitetail wildlife management plan for that property, which included timber stand improvement, a lot of bedding areas, some mature buck bedding areas, and a lot of habitat improvement, if you will, because the majority of the forest, which had been timbered about 12 years prior to my retirement, was mature forest. And then the place where my wife and I built our forever home, as we call it, after 14 moves in the military. That was a little over 50 acres, another piece of property, and it was all mature forest. It had not been timbered or touched for 70 years. So through looking for programs, I read this article in a new local newspaper and found out about NRCS. I ended up talking to Dr. Kyle Aldinger, who I think is on the webinar tonight, and told him kind of what I was doing, what I was interested in, and he helped me with that operation. And why NRCS? I will say that I'd worked for the federal government, so I had really no issue with working with the government again as a private landowner. Plus the benefits of the cost sharing from the NRCS programs, and with their focus on the landowner's goals as their primary piece, as you heard Jane brief a while ago, it really puts the landowner in the driver's seat to allow the NRCS to come in and help you, help yourself, and help the local wildlife. And I'll just tell you, I mean, right now, if you've looked at any of the wildlife across the nation, we're in the largest extinction event in recorded history. So right now, our problem in West Virginia is we went from about 30% forest coverage of the state of West Virginia in 1930 to over 78% today. And a lot of that is mature forest, as Jane explained. And white-tailed deer, bear, ruffed grouse, and all these songbirds, the cerulean warbler, golden-winged warbler, and many other species require successional forests to maintain their breeding areas and their habitat preference to raise their fledglings. So that all really fit together well with my plan, and we were able to develop a plan to do that. It took about 6 months, probably maybe 8 months, to get all the paperwork done, the planning done, the flora and fauna inventories done, and kind of the prescriptions tied to my plan, which was very wildlife focused, into programs that Dr. Aldinger had put together and into the practices, but they fit really well. And then they did it. On this piece of property, just a quick description. It's a 154 acre piece of property. It's split almost down the middle, 76 acres on the south side of the Little Kanawha River, and about 75 or 76 acres on the north side of Little Kanawha River. So I have a south facing slope, a north facing slope, which trigger different tree species and plant communities. But I've done 66 acres of management, and Jane and I just last 2 weeks ago, I guess, marked another 11 acres off to do some more thinning and clear cut work on there as well, which really fits well into my whitetail plan, but also benefits the cerulean warblers, which is what my project is based on. The cost of my project really is my own individual time, effort, cost of a couple chainsaws. Generally, to do a 1 acre clear cut, it takes me about 8 hours to do that safely. And if I'm burning fuel, I use a lot of premix in my chainsaws because, again, I do a lot of the work as part of my business as well. But so I'll run through probably several gallons of gasoline a day in my chainsaws, and generally that runs somewhere around $16 to $20, depending on the cost of gas. So right now, 1 gallon of premix is about $22 a gallon. So you can kind of do the estimate there based on today's cost versus what it was, a year ago. And then, so overall, the cost of my 66 acres, other than my personal time, is probably less than $1,000 overall. And the next question there on my slide, NRCS cost sharing, did it cover my costs? Yes, it more than covered my costs, because a lot of the prescriptions are by acre. So if you're doing 10 or 11 acres and let's just say you're doing timber stand improvement, and there are various cost schedules. So you'll have to look at that when you do your contracting, but generally those will more than cover, generally triple or quadruple what it costs you to cut it. Now that may be different if you hire a contractor to come in and do the work for you. If you can tie that with a timber harvest or something like that, it will actually benefit you as well, as long as your forester understands your NRCS goals and he or she talked to your NRCS point of contact. But if you have property in West Virginia, and in this case, you likely do if you're on this webinar and you're focused on, maple syrup production, and you have some portions of your property that could benefit from additional income, I think this is a great program to use, not to mention the benefit for wildlife, which I've went a lot away from kind of just whitetail rough grouse management to kind of ecosystem management now with a lot of clients I've worked with across the state. But it is amazing to see the results. Just one anecdotal result is that we did a 1 acre clear cut about 2 years ago. And the difference in wildlife use of that 1 acre clear cut over the year is about 300% increase in the use of wildlife. And that's songbirds, white-tailed deer. As you know, white-tailed deer live and are edge feeders and love successional growth. The more food you have on the forest floor, the healthier your herd is and the better your white-tailed deer will function. And, if you're a white-tailed deer buck hunter, the bigger racks they'll produce because they'll get that more nutrition and more minerals and nutrients from the soil and from those plants that are in a successional status, versus having a mature canopy where they only get acorns, for 2 or 3 months out of the year. So the diversity that comes from these practices that the NRCS offers, and some of their practices, I'll say, are well worth it. And if you do have a timber operation, I would almost guarantee you're going to see some type of invasive species return or rear its ugly head once that is complete. So there are NRCS programs to help you deal with that, such as the Brose Management Program, because I timbered part of my property and now I'm dealing with Japanese stiltgrass as my major issue. And it's an annual battle to take care of that. And if you've priced herbicide lately, you know the cost of that. So that's all I have. Pending any questions in the question and answer session. So Jane, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. I could go back to mine, and I have a couple slides just to finish up with, specifically about the financial assistance aspects in a little more detail. Perfect. So as Kevin said, he's a forestry contractor. If you're a landowner and decide to hire a forestry contractor, you have an independent contract, which is outside of the contract you have with NRCS. If you happen to be a forestry contractor and you'd like to reach out and participate and do work on the contracts, NRCS has a database list that we're growing. We could add you to the list or give you more information on how to be a contractor in that context. But most important for landowners is to understand that any contract you have with a contractor is independent. NRCS doesn't endorse or support particular contractors. We just have a network and we'll visit the site with your contractor. Absolutely happy to help with implementation visits and that sort of thing, but you're hiring your people to do your work, and that's your business, which is good. And your cost share assistance from NRCS can be used to pay your forestry contractor. And just to be a little bit aware of how the practices break down. First thing to know is anyone gets a technical assistance, everyone is eligible for that, and that's free. And then only some people wish to apply for the financial assistance aspect at all. Interested individuals may apply at any time of year. And if you do make that application, your conservation plan is your application for financial assistance. Then each of your practices, they get two things. You get a schedule that you are legally obligated to follow on schedule. So your practices, instead of saying, I want to do a thinning within 5 years. It will be, you're going to finish thinning by 2022. Once the thinning is complete, you get your cost share rate. It's for a thinning. Last year, the outcome was about $2,000 for a 10-acre thinning. It's going to range. Everybody's contract is different. There's a different range spectrum of practices. On average, this is about what it was last year, just to show that heavy thinning you want to have. So the next year you're doing your other thinning, finish it by 2023. Once the work's complete, you get your assistance payoff. Then you and your planner decide, okay, the following years I'd like to do a clear cut, each one a year. Your clear cut after you finish is reimbursed at a certain rate. Then say, we're monitoring that gray area. We're going to try the silver pasture, maybe if it's regenerating well. So we have monitoring practice. We want to do that every year, and you'd be reimbursed about $400 on a 20-acre plot, about. And then say a good way to end your plan, we've finished all of our practices. We want to expand the monitoring to your whole property. And then that'll see how you want to adapt and expand going forward. So now you have a timeline that takes you the next 10 years. That's a really ambitious plan. It's all about the landowners in the driver's seat. So it all varies how many years you want to work on your plan, the amount that you want to obligate to yourself. You could have a whole forest management plan and then just obligate for one practice. You could apply multiple times on the same property to get through all the practices, different things like that, depending on your situation. So we just work with your planner at NRCS to come up with a plan and an application that's going to work for how you want to do things. The second biggest way you would get financial assistance would be for that forester. So there are specific programs in EQIP General Forestry. They're not based on practice. They're based on getting a forest management plan written. And you could either work with NRCS TSPs. Almost all the costs would be covered from a TSP through what's called the CPA 106 program. Or your private consulting foresters, some of your per practice rates cover, or that you can get a larger payout at the end to cover the use of a consulting forester. There's going to be more out-of-pocket expense with the consulting forester versus the TSP. And that's, again, we could talk about like the pros and cons of doing each program, but if it comes down to you interviewing different foresters and picking someone who works for you and then going back with NRCS to see what program fits your needs. And we definitely want to hear from you. So please reach out. If you're interested in the programs, just want to learn more, just talk about birds or grazing or anything like that, we do want to hear from you. So
awesome. Thank you, Kevin and Jane, so much. I learned a lot, and those videos of the birds was very, very cool. I didn't realize that the cerulean or birds sort of prepared their dinner before eating. That was very interesting. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and start the Q&A. For those that joined after that introduction on how to submit your question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and submit your questions there. We have a couple coming in. Yeah, or if you have any comments, you can chat to us in the chat box, which is, I think should be at the center of your screen on that panel. So our first, so Jeff asks, Kevin, this is directed to you. Have you implemented quote unquote hinge cutting within your forest land? If so, can you talk about any observed impacts on the wildlife habitat?
Yeah, I do hinge cutting as a wildlife, as one of the techniques. It's also tied to tying it back to NRCS to the living brush pile practice through the NRCS program. And there are different areas in the underneath living brush pile. I generally, from my standpoint, I do hinge cutting for a couple of reasons. One, side cover for whitetail and putting food on the ground. So it depends on the species of tree too, but I do use a lot of hinge cutting, especially in bedding areas, feeding corridors, what I call stubble fields, or if I'm trying to windrow and turn deer a certain direction in part of the wildlife, part of my deer management plan for harvest. Or if I have a small kill food plot that's designed in a program, I'll use them to hinge cuts to channel the deer into the areas I want them to go. Again, the species of tree really determines the hinge cut effectiveness for me anyways. I have a lot of bedding in those areas, a lot of food. If you do white oak or some of those maple, red maple especially, deer love red maple and white oak. So they're basically across the areas I go back and look at where I've hinge cut, I have about 100% browse rate. If you hinge cut a lot, you can affect the regen of certain species. Now, with that said, you can hinge cut trees of certain specific diameters, killing that tree in the hinge cut process. And I've been doing some experimentation with oak regen, planting acorns in those hinge cut trees or in down treetops to try to get oak regeneration, because I live in a heavy whitetail deer per square mile area, high density. So what I find is if there's an oak regenning and you don't have 40 acres of habitat management on your property that keep those deer fed, they will eat every oak regen piece you have, or maple or whatever it is. They'll clean it up. So by hinge cutting trees on it or using treetops, I've been experimenting planting acorns in those treetops, and so far I've had pretty good success, at least over the last 2 years, of getting oaks up 4, 5, 6 foot tall. In some cases where the deer are leaving them alone because it's too much trouble for them to get to, especially if I've done other habitat practices. So yes, I use hinge cutting. I like hinge cutting, and I use it a lot in those instances.
Kevin, can you define hinge cutting? What is this practice that you're doing?
Yeah, hinge cutting basically, and again, you want to use a smaller diameter tree, probably 2 inches up to about 6, 8. You just got to be careful from a safety standpoint. I have cut 8-inch trees and a little bit larger, but depends on the tree species. And the intent of hinge cutting is cutting a tree. Usually you do it in the fall or winter when the trees are dormant. So you keep the tree alive, and you cut about 60% of the way with a horizontal cut with a chainsaw into the tree or a handsaw. And then I use a habitat hook to reach up, or a rope, and grab the tree and lay it where I want to lay it. And what this does is the tree regens or begins to grow again in the spring. As it leaves out, it puts that food on the ground. It provides canopy cover, and it provides some cover for the other plant species on the ground. Again, if you do it really heavy in an area, we're focused on diversity, you may end up having only hinge cut oak trees around, which a deer will be happy, but some other species may not. So you need to do it with a whole kind of ecosystem in thought. But that's what hinge cut is. You can cut farther through until the tree falls, and it'll hinge it. Typically, that will kill the tree if you cut through both sides of the cambium layer, but you're trying to leave one side of the cambium layer intact as the tree lays down, so that it will continue to grow. And I've had hinge cut trees now in year 5, and they continue to grow vertically or horizontally, on the ground. And the deer seem to like them. They're back here all the time.
Awesome. Jeff asked another question. Is there any documented research data or estimates that show the impacts in sap flow or sugar content of a light thinning to release canopy on sugar maples? I don't know, Kate, you might.
Yeah, so there is some documented research on this. it has been shown that thinning can increase your sugar content, especially if you're thinking about how many sides of the tree you're releasing, right? So a lot of us know this, sugar content in your sap is based on your photosynthesis in during the growing season and the sugar storage within the tree. But there are also a lot of other factors that influence sugar content, even down to things like site quality and like rain, groundwater stores, all kinds of stuff, snowpack. It is there's a lot out there that influences it. It's not always a one answer, a one shot answer. The best thing to do, honestly, is we have some people down here that have done it, is start with thinning one part of your sugar bush, especially if you have a part that you can monitor your sap sugar content on separately from the rest. This kind of gives you an estimate on if this is actually going to help you. Some places it might actually make a big difference with your growth rates and sugar content. Other places it may or may not. So you can kind of start to get an estimate on, is your sugar increasing by 0.1%? Is it increasing by 0.5%? How much is your growth rate increased? And check back in on that for a year or two, and it'll sort of give you an idea, is this worth your time and effort, right? The other benefits, though, that come with thinning a sugar bush is sort of what Jane talked about, with help with regeneration, help with longevity. It can be really important, especially for tubing systems, to take out older trees that you think might fall on you anyways before the sugar season happens. All of us sugar makers out there know the worst feeling is when you wake up one morning and all of a sudden one of your main lines is down because there's a big old tree across it. So there is some other like fringe benefits to thinning beyond just sap flow and sugar content. Jeff, if you're looking for a scientific article, a great place to start is mapleresearch.org. That would be a really good place to just do a quick search. I'm sure something will come up on some studies of the impact on thinning on sugar content for you. And I can go ahead and type that answer with this question. It's mapleresearch.org. Wait, yeah, I'll double check the URL, but it'll be there.
Thanks. This is for Jane. What are government programs why are government programs focused on golden winged warbler and cerulean warbler?
These are top two focal species because they're one of the most in decline in North America. So, for example, cerulean warbler, 2/3 of the remaining birds live in West Virginia, which means that it's a very rare continentally. So West Virginia is the cerulean warbler's last stronghold. So it's critically important that we have this restoration in West Virginia for this species in particular. Similarly, golden winged warbler, the population is declining quite significantly in Appalachia, as in nearly extinct in Appalachia. There's another population up in Minnesota of golden winged warblers that's more stable, but the golden winged warbler population in Appalachia is imperiled and may go extinct within the next 20 years or so without this reintroduction of young forests and shrubland that we're maintaining long-term. So that's why these two species pop out as the flagship from the wildlife conservation point of view. The second angle on these two birds is it integrates with like agriculture and farming, farm forest planning, just like the talk is about. Cerulean warbler and golden winged warbler covering these other types of forest habitat. So when you're doing something other than timbering, like the majority of West Virginia landowners are doing, only 25% are interested in timbering. We now have programs that cover the other forest types.
Interesting. Well, Jane had mentioned several discussion topics. Is anyone in the audience interested in sharing if they have a deer problem, or wanting to diagnose if they do, or thinning, if anyone's tried thinning, has any observations they'd like to share? Kyle has a deer problem. Oh,
I
gosh.
believe
Yeah.
Kyle has too much non-native grass on his property, and that is exacerbating his deer problem.
Oh.
Though I would like to hear his opinions before I decide what's wrong with it.
Anyone else? I was wondering if there's like a handout or somewhere on the NRCS website that shares the information on grazing management for the I think it was the cerulean warbler sites, or
It's the golden wing warbler.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the one that where pasture active
Yes.
grazing can be used.
Yeah, with like it's limited to cattle and a small amount. I just wondering if there's something out there with that information.
There is in a short document. Your best way is to skip to the site visit. It's so site specific.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So Kyle put up a link for some of that info.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Yeah, another this popped into my mind, but another interesting tie is up in New York. People are starting to certify their maple syrup as bird friendly, because it's being made on property that is actively being managed for different bird species. So if anybody's interested in that, let me know, and I'm happy to reach out to. It's the folks from Cornell that are working on it, so I'm happy to put folks in contact if folks are interested. And also just a quick shout out, if you have maple syrup specific website or questions, they can either go to forest@future.edu or syrup@future.edu. Both emails will get to either Evelyn or I. So
Yeah, I'll put a link to that. It's bird friendly maple if you want to find out more. Oops, sorry, that was meant to go to everyone. There we go. That's the link on bird friendly maple going on in mainly New England, but they're wanting to expand the program. So maybe it'll come down to West Virginia. All right. I guess I'll ask one more question and then we can wrap up. How do you all rate these applications, and what does a successful application sort of look like?
That's a really great question. So the core of the application is the conservation plan. We make the plan before we think about the funding. So there is a certain, once a landowner decides to apply for funding, we submit some additional paperwork. Specifically, there's some ranking questions that the planners see on our side of the USDA system. And so we'll have inventory data and objective measurements in terms of how much suitable pasture land is on the site already. And we'll say there's 70% suitable habitat, and that gets a high score, for example. We'll say how much tree cover is desirable species already. And we'll give it each score, however the landowner comes out gets a certain amount of points for that answer. Then every single application statewide is funded along the same system of points ranked side by side. And that's how you get to the outcome, which projects have the most environmental benefit. So the higher your score, the more environmental benefit your project has, and those people have the rank or get their application for funding funded until we run out of funding in the pool.
We did have one more question asking if the warblers are listed as endangered.
The golden wing warbler is listed as near threatened. The cerulean, I do not think has made an official endangered species listing. It's so it's not listed with the federal government. It is listed with what's called the Partners in Flight, which is our continental conservation NGO. It's like the largest bird conservation project in North America, and they have it listed as a top priority species, both of them. But only the golden-winged warbler is listed federally.
What are some of those tree over canopy tree species that rank higher for these bird habitats?
Okay. Yeah. So desirable species, it's going to be size of the tree. So if it's a hardwood and it's 16 inches or larger, that's your best quality. And then you think about, okay, of your 16-inch trees, what species specifically would be white oak, sugar maple. Sugar maple is the most preferred nest tree. So maybe a male cerulean is going to pick a stand with a lot of white oaks, but since a female is picking the nest site, she looks for sugar maples for reasons unknown, but they do nest most commonly in sugar maples. So it's very interesting. I didn't know that, but so sugar maple, definitely a top species. Hickories, any of your hardwood hickories, shagbark hickory especially, but it's the first criteria is forest structure, so large trees with canopy gaps. And then golden wing warbler, it's again structure. So shrubland with a mix of layers. So mostly shrubs 15 feet or shorter, ground grasses, native wildflowers. It's about 30% cover or less of herbs, and then canopy trees, no more than 15 trees an acre. So this is open land. So 0 to 15 trees an acre, but very productive and fascinating habitat type.
All right. Any last questions before we sign off? I will let you all know that next month, our webinar will be a presentation from the NRCS state office. They'll be presenting on even more NRCS conservation programs, including a brand new program for maple syrup producers in West Virginia that supports you in improving the efficiencies of your operation. So if you're thinking of upgrading your evaporator or technologies, you'll want to tune in. And then once, I think right before you sign off, you'll a poll will pop up on your window. So if you don't mind just taking the time to complete that for us, we'd appreciate it. But yeah, I think that's a wrap. There we go.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Please reach out if you have any thoughts or questions.
Good night, everyone.
And just a reminder, y'all will get a link to a recording of this webinar. So if you forgot to take notes on something, you can go back and rewatch it.